Some losses change you so completely you forget who you were before the fire. For 63-year-old Fern Larrimore, 10 years of silence felt safer than remembering. She lives alone in a mountain cabin where the only sound is wind through pine trees and the creak of her front porch. When she buys a broken 1885 prairie wagon for $10, folks think it's just another strange project from the widow they stopped understanding long ago. But Fern isn't restoring that old wagon. She's building something nobody sees coming. Then someone from her past shows up at her door, and everything she's been hiding starts to surface. What could one woman build from a pile of rotted wood that would change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air on Bitterroot Ridge carried the scent of pine and coming snow. Fern Larrimore stood on her porch with a cup of black coffee, watching dawn paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. This was her favorite hour, before the world demanded anything from her, before memory had time to sharpen its edges. Her cabin sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. She'd chosen isolation deliberately after the fire, sought it like medicine. The structure was simple, 2 rooms, a loft, and a stone fireplace that Samuel had built with his own hands 20 years ago. Back when they'd first arrived in Montana, back when the future stretched out before them like an unmarked trail, she finished her coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. Work was waiting, same as every day. Her trapline needed checking, firewood needed splitting, and the small workshop behind the cabin always had some project demanding attention. Keeping busy was how she survived. Idle hands gave the past too much room to breathe. The workshop had been Samuel's pride. He designed it himself, with northern light flooding through tall windows and enough space for his woodworking benches, his tools, his dreams. The original building had burned with him that October night 10 years ago. Fern had rebuilt it the following spring, working alone, driving nails until her hands bled. She'd needed something to do with the rage and grief that threatened to pull her under like a riptide. Now, the workshop held her tools alongside his. She'd kept everything that survived the fire, his leather work gloves, oil-stained and worn soft from years of use. His hand, planes and chisels, the wooden handles darkened by the oils from his palms. His measuring tools, precise and reliable. She used them all, kept them sharp and ready, maintained them the way he'd taught her. Samuel had been a master craftsman, a wagon builder and carpenter who understood wood the way some men understand horses or land. He'd learned the trade from his grandfather, who'd learned it from his grandfather, before that. Traditional methods, passed down through generations, skills that were dying out in a world of factories and mass production. He'd taught Fern everything he knew. Not because she'd asked, but because he believed knowledge was meant to be shared. On long winter evenings, he'd show her how to read wood grain, how to select the right piece for the right purpose, how to join wood without nails, using mortise and tenon, dovetails, traditional joinery that would outlast metal, how to steam and bend, how to treat and finish, how to build things that would stand for 100 years or more. She'd been a willing student, hungry to understand the work that gave him such satisfaction. Together they'd restored furniture, built cabinets, repaired wagons for the few ranchers who still used them. Their partnership had been equal, built on respect and shared purpose. They'd worked side by side in comfortable silence, reading each other's movements like dancers who'd learned the same choreography. The fire had taken all of that in a single night. It started in the dry grass behind the original workshop, sparked by something they never determined what. The wind had been fierce that evening, pushing flames faster than anyone could react. Samuel had gone back inside for something, maybe tools, maybe the journals where he kept records of every project. The roof collapsed before he could get out. Fern had tried to reach him, gotten close enough that the heat singed her hair and scorched her lungs. Neighbors had pulled her back, held her while she screamed herself hoarse. She still couldn't think about that night without her chest tightening, without the smell of smoke filling her nostrils, even though no fire burned. So mostly she didn't think about it. She kept moving, kept working, kept her hands busy, and her mind occupied with immediate tasks. The town of Bitterroot Ridge consisted of a general store, a ranger station, a post office, and a handful of houses scattered along the main road. Population maybe 200 if you counted the ranches in the surrounding valleys. Folks knew each other's business because there wasn't much else to know. They'd learned to leave Fern alone, to nod politely when they saw her at the store, but not to press for conversation. She preferred it that way. Their pity had been suffocating in those first months after Samuel died. The casseroles, the concerned visits, the offers of help she didn't want and couldn't accept. Eventually they'd stopped coming around, stopped trying to draw her out. She'd become a fixture of the landscape, predictable and distant as the mountains themselves. Last Tuesday, she'd driven into town for supplies and noticed a handwritten sign at the ranger station. Estate auction Saturday, 10 am. She almost drove past, but something made her pull over. Inside, Ranger Tom Beckworth was sorting through items salvaged from an abandoned homestead up in the national forest. "Fern," he'd said, surprised to see. "Been a while. Need to post that auction somewhere more visible," she'd replied, ignoring the pleasantry. "Nobody'll see it here." "Not expecting much interest," Tom had admitted. "Mostly junk, old camping gear, some furniture falling apart. Found it all in a collapsed cabin nobody's claimed in 40 years. She'd walked through the items spread across the ranger station's backlot. Most of it was worthless, just as Tom said. But then she'd seen it a prairie wagon, the kind settlers used in the 1882nd. It was in terrible condition, rotted wood and rusted metal, wheels warped beyond use. But something about it called to her. The craftsmanship was visible even through the decay. Whoever built this wagon had known what they were doing. The joinery was precise, the proportions correct. This had been quality work once, before weather and time took their toll. Saturday morning she'd returned to the auction. Maybe 15 people showed up, most of them looking for cheap furniture or tools. When the wagon came up for bidding, nobody raised a hand. Tom had started at $50, dropped to $25, then $20, $10. Fern had called out. Tom had looked relieved. Sold to Fern Larrimore for $10. A few neighbors had watched her load the wagon onto her trailer, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Old Hollis Grant had shaken his head. "That thing's firewood, Fern." "Maybe," she'd agreed, and driven home. That was 3 weeks ago. The wagon now sat in her workshop, and the more she studied it, the more certain she became that it was worth saving. The wood was predominantly white oak, the traditional choice for wagon construction. Oak was strong, weather-resistant, flexible enough to handle rough terrain. Whoever built this had used period-correct techniques throughout. She'd spent hours carefully examining every joint, every piece of hardware, every detail of construction. The wagon told a story, if you knew how to read it. This builder had cared about his work, had taken pride in getting every detail right, the kind of pride Samuel had brought to his own projects. On her work table lay the charred wedding photograph, the only item she'd rescued from the fire. The frame was blackened, the glass cracked, but their faces were still visible. Samuel, grinning, confident and strong. Herself at 33, leaning into his shoulder, genuinely happy. Sometimes she'd catch herself looking at it and couldn't remember what that happiness felt like. The photograph reminded her who she'd been before. Loss carved her into someone else. Before survival became her only ambition, before silence felt safer than connection. She picked up Samuel's work gloves from the bench, held them for a moment, then pulled them on. They were too large for her hands, but she wore them anyway when she worked. It was the closest she could come to having him beside her again. The wagon waited. She'd already begun the careful process of dismantling. Photographing each stage, taking notes on construction methods. Some pieces were beyond saving and would need replacement, but the frame was solid enough to restore. The wheels could be rebuilt. The hardware could be cleaned and treated. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd bought it. Maybe because seeing quality craftsmanship decay felt like a personal offense. Maybe because the work would fill her days with purpose. Maybe because fixing broken things was easier than fixing herself. Evening was settling over the mountains when she finally left the workshop. Inside the cabin, she heated soup on the wood stove and ate standing at the counter, too tired to bother with sitting down. This was her life, now work and solitude, the same routine day after day. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was the life she'd built from the ashes of the one she'd lost. She washed her bowl and spoon, banked the fire, and climbed the ladder to her loft. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Samuel used to know all the constellations, would point them out and tell her their stories. She'd forgotten most of them now. Sleep came slowly, as it always did. In the quiet darkness, memory was harder to keep at bay. She could almost hear Samuel's voice, feel his presence in the empty space beside her. Almost, but not quite. And that almost was the cruelest part. Tomorrow she'd return to the wagon, continue the slow work of restoration. It was all she had now, the work, the solitude, the careful routine that kept her standing. It would have to be enough. The breakthrough came on a grey Wednesday afternoon while Fern was stripping old paint from the wagon's undercarriage. She'd been working methodically, using a chemical stripper and a scraper, removing layers of weathering and neglect. The work required patience and a steady hand. Virtues she'd learned from Samuel. The scraper caught on something irregular beneath the paint. She leaned closer, adjusting the work light. There was texture there, carved into the wood itself. She applied more stripper, worked more carefully, and gradually a shape emerged from decades of concealment. It was a maker's mark, a carved nameplate, deeply incised into the oak. Her hands began to shake as the letters became clear. S. Larrimore, 1884. Samuel's mark, his work. She sat back hard, the scraper falling from her nerveless fingers. This wagon, this specific wagon she'd bought for $10 at a ranger station auction, had been built by her husband nearly 40 years before they'd met. The shop fell away. She was somewhere else, listening to Samuel tell stories on winter evenings. He'd talked about his early work, the wagons he'd built before settling in Montana. There'd been one commission he was particularly proud of, a prairie wagon for a young couple heading west. He'd put everything he knew into that piece, made it strong enough to cross the continent. He'd told her. He never knew what became of it, assumed it had fallen apart somewhere on the endless plains or been broken up for parts years ago. But here it was, returned to her like a message in a bottle cast across decades. Fern stood on shaking legs and walked to the cabin. She needed air, needed to think, needed to understand what this meant. The November wind bit through her flannel shirt, but she barely felt it. Her mind was spinning through implications, through the impossible coincidence of this wagon finding its way back to Samuel's workshop, to her hands. No, not coincidence. It couldn't be. She thought about the auction, about the ranger station, about the abandoned homestead where the wagon had been found. 40 years was a long time. The couple Samuel built it for would be in their 80s now, if they were still alive. The wagon could have changed hands a dozen times, could have traveled thousands of miles, and yet it came home. That evening, she couldn't settle. She paced the cabin, started tasks and abandoned them, finally gave up and returned to the workshop. She stood before the wagon, running her hands over the wood, tracing Samuel's carved signature with her fingertips. He'd been 24 when he made this mark, a young craftsman proud of his work. She'd been a child somewhere, unaware that decades later she'd marry the man who built this wagon, that she'd lose him to fire, that she'd spend 10 years alone before his early work found its way back to her. The next morning, a truck pulled up her drive. Fern watched from the kitchen window, wary of visitors. A woman climbed out, older than Fern by a few years, moving carefully like someone whose joints complained in cold weather. Recognition hit like a fist to the chest. Lila Sanderson, Samuel's younger sister. Fern hadn't seen her since the funeral, hadn't seen any of Samuel's family since then. She'd cut those ties cleanly, unable to bear their grief layered on top of her own, unable to be around people who reminded her so completely of what she'd lost. But Lila was walking toward her porch now, and there was nowhere to hide. Fern opened the door before Lila could knock. They stood looking at each other across the threshold, 10 years of absence hanging between them like smoke. "Fern," Lila said quietly, "I heard you bought Samuel's wagon. How did you—" "Tom Beckworth's wife is my cousin. She mentioned it, thought I should know." Lila's eyes were kind but direct. "Can I come in?" Fern wanted to say no, wanted to close the door and retreat into her carefully maintained solitude. But something in Lila's expression, hope, maybe, or determination, made her step aside. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee. Neither of them drank. The silence stretched out, not quite comfortable but not hostile either. "I didn't know it was his when I bought it," Fern finally said. "Found his mark yesterday." Lila nodded slowly. "He talked about that wagon, was proud of it, said it was some of Varnum, his finest early work. He told me the story. I didn't realize it was the same one. They're rare now," Lila said. "Authentic 1882s prairie wagons in any condition. That one being Samuel's makes it even more special." Fern's throat tightened. "I'm restoring it." "I know. Tom said you loaded it carefully, like it mattered." Lila reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound book. "I brought you something. Thought you might want it." The journal was old, the leather worn soft. Fern recognized it immediately, Samuel's handwriting on the cover, his project records. "His early journals," Lila explained, "from 1883 to 1885. The wagon project should be documented in there. Mother kept them after he died. She passed last year, and I've been going through her things. When I heard about the wagon, I thought—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "I thought you should have them." Fern took the journal with trembling hands. Just holding it brought Samuel closer, made him real again in a way that hurt and healed simultaneously. "Why now?" Fern asked. "Why come here after all this time?" Lila met her eyes directly. "Because you bought that wagon for a reason, even if you didn't know what it was yet. Because Samuel would want you to finish what he started. Because family doesn't stop being family just because it hurts too much to face." The words hung in the air. Fern wanted to argue, to defend her decade of isolation. But sitting across from Lila, seeing her own grief reflected in another's eyes, she felt something crack in the walls she'd built. "I don't know if I can do this," Fern admitted. "Do what? Restore the wagon?" "Any of it. Open up again. Let people back in. It's easier alone." Lila's expression softened with understanding. "Easier isn't always better, and you don't have to do it alone." She stood, gathering her coat. "I'm staying at the motel in town for a few days. If you want company while you work, or if you want to talk, or if you just want someone to hand you tools in silence, I'm here." After Lila left, Fern sat with the journal unopened on the table. The cabin felt different now, as if Lila's visit had let in air that had been stale too long. Outside, afternoon light slanted through the pines, and somewhere in the distance a raven called. Finally, as evening darkened the windows, Fern opened the journal. Samuel's handwriting leapt off the page, confident and clear. She found the wagon entry quickly, pages of detailed notes, sketches, measurements. His pride in the work came through every word. And then, near the end of the entry, a line that made her breath catch. "Someday I'll build a life in those mountains myself, a place where craft and tradition matter, a place to call home." He'd written that in 1884, decades before they met, before they made their life on Bitterroot Ridge. The wagon had been built with dreams of Montana already taking shape. Fern closed the journal and pressed her palms against her eyes. The coincidence of This wagon finding her wasn't divine intervention or fate, but it was something. A thread connecting past and present, a reminder that Samuel's dreams had been real and had mattered. She looked toward the workshop where the wagon waited. Samuel's early masterwork and her current project. Maybe Lila was right. Maybe some things weren't meant to be done alone. Fern didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with Samuel's journal, reading by lamplight, absorbing every detail of the wagon's construction. His voice came through the pages methodical, proud, passionate about the work. He documented everything: wood selection, joint construction, hardware specifications, even the weather conditions during different phases of building. The wagon had been commissioned by a couple named Emma and Joseph Kincaid, young homesteaders planning to travel from Pennsylvania to Montana Territory. Samuel had been 24, establishing his reputation as a craftsman. He'd taken the commission seriously, building the wagon to withstand continental travel over rough terrain. His sketches were precise and beautiful. Fern traced them with her finger, recognizing the way he drew, the careful proportions, the attention to structural integrity. She could almost see his young hands moving across the page, planning each component with care. By dawn, she'd read the entire section 3 times. When morning light finally filtered through the windows, she felt exhausted and strangely energized. The journal had given her something she hadn't realized: she needed connection to Samuel's younger self, to his dreams before she knew him. She made coffee and was standing on the porch when Lila's truck appeared on the road. Part of her wanted to retreat inside, to maintain the isolation that felt safer. But another part, smaller, quieter, but growing, wanted the company. Lila climbed out with 2 travel mugs and a paper bag. "Brought breakfast. Hope you like blueberry muffins." "You didn't have to." "I know. Can I see the workshop?" They walked together through morning cold, their breath misting in the air. Inside the workshop, Lila stopped and looked around, taking in the organized tools, the careful workspace, the wagon dominating the center of the room. "You kept his gloves," she said softly, noticing them on the workbench. "Use them when I work." Lila nodded, understanding. She approached the wagon slowly, running her hand along the frame the way Fern had done countless times. "It's in worse shape than I expected. 40 years of weather will do that. But the bones are solid. He built it right. Can you save it?" "Yes." Fern's voice was certain. "It'll take time and the right materials, but yes, I can bring it back." Lila smiled, and something in her expression reminded Fern so strongly of Samuel that her chest ached. "Then let me help. I'm not the craftsman you are, but I remember some of what he taught me when we were young. I can hand you tools, organize, materials, learn what you're willing to teach." Fern wanted to refuse, wanted to keep this project solitary, under her control. But looking at Lila's hopeful expression, remembering the isolation of the past decade, she found herself nodding instead. "Okay, but we do it right. Period-correct methods, traditional techniques. The way Samuel would have done it. Wouldn't want it any other way." They started with assessment. Fern walked Lila through the wagon's structure, explaining what needed replacing, what could be restored, what required specialized materials. The work was extensive, but not impossible. The frame needed several oak replacements. All 4 wheels required rebuilding. The hardware needed chemical treatment to remove rust. The canvas cover was beyond saving and would need complete replication. Lila listened carefully, asking intelligent questions, taking notes in a small notebook she pulled from her pocket. Her interest seemed genuine, not just family obligation. When Fern demonstrated how to assess wood rot using a probe and careful pressure, Lila practiced on several boards, her technique improving quickly. They worked through the morning in companionable near silence. Fern found herself relaxing incrementally, the initial wariness fading as they fell into a rhythm. Having another person in the workspace felt strange at first, then gradually more natural, like remembering how to do something you'd once known well. Around noon, they broke for the muffins and coffee. Sitting on workshop stools, Lila said, "You read the journal." "All night." "Did it help?" Fern considered the question. "It reminded me he was real, that we were real. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined all of it, the life we had, the happiness, like maybe it was too good to be true." "It was real," Lila said firmly. "I saw you together. You were happy, both of you." The validation settled something in Fern's chest. "I cut everyone out after he died. I know that. I just couldn't." "I understand. We all grieve differently. No judgment from me." "How are your kids?" Fern asked, suddenly realizing she knew nothing about Lila's life over the past decade. Lila's expression tightened slightly. "Martin's in Seattle. Haven't heard from him in 3 years. Jessica's in Denver, sends a card at Christmas. My ex-husband remarried, has stepkids he prefers." She stopped, gathered herself. "It's been a difficult few years. I'm sorry." "Me too. I think that's partly why I came here. When I heard about the wagon, about you taking on this project, it felt like a sign, like maybe I could be part of something meaningful again." They looked at each other across the small space, two women shaped by loss, seeking purpose in restoration work. "We'll need materials," Fern said finally. "White oak for the replacements, period-correct hardware, traditional treatments and finishes. There's a salvage place about 30 miles out Hollis Grant's yard. He specializes in historical materials. Want to go today?" Fern hesitated, then nodded. The prospect of leaving the mountain, of venturing out into the world, made her anxious. But the project required it, and having Lila along made it seem less daunting. They took Lila's truck, driving down the mountain through pine forest and open meadows. The day was clear and cold. The kind of November weather that promised winter wasn't far off. Fern watched the landscape pass, feeling like she was emerging from a cave after years underground. Hollis Grant's salvage yard sprawled across 5 acres, filled with architectural remnants, old lumber, vintage hardware, and the accumulated detritus of 100 demolished buildings. Hollis himself was in his 80s, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fair dealing. He recognized Fern immediately. "Fern Larrimore. Been a long time. Hollis, I need white oak and traditional hardware, working on an 1884 prairie wagon." His eyebrows rose. "That the one from the ranger station auction?" "That's the one. Heard you got it for $10. That's either brilliant or crazy. Both, probably. It was built by my husband." Hollis's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "Samuel's work? Well then, let me show you what I've got." He led them through the yard, pointing out suitable lumber, pulling hardware from organized bins, discussing specifications and prices. His knowledge was encyclopedic, his prices fair. By the time they loaded everything into Lila's truck, Fern felt confident they had what they needed to begin serious restoration. On the drive back, Lila said, "He knew Samuel. Most people around here did. He had a good reputation. Still does, sounds like. That matters." Fern realized Lila was right. Samuel's legacy persisted in people's memories, in the respect still accorded his name. Finishing the wagon honored that legacy, kept his craft alive beyond his death. Back at the cabin, they unloaded the materials into the workshop. Evening was approaching, the light turning golden through the pines. Lila lingered by her truck, clearly reluctant to leave. "Stay for dinner," Fern heard herself say. "Nothing fancy, just stew. But stay." Lila's smile was answer enough. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern. Lila arrived each morning. They worked through the day, and evenings they shared simple meals before Lila returned to town. The rhythm felt natural, like falling back into a dance half forgotten but not entirely lost. The restoration demanded precision and patience. They started with the frame, carefully removing damaged sections and fitting new oak pieces using traditional joinery. Fern taught Lila to read wood grain, to select pieces where the grain ran in directions that would provide maximum strength. She demonstrated mortise and tenon joints, showed how to cut them precisely so they'd fit together without gaps. Lila proved an apt student. Her hands weren't as steady as Fern's, but she was careful and willing to redo work that wasn't perfect. She asked good questions and remembered the answers. Working alongside her, Fern felt something rusty inside herself, beginning to loosen. One afternoon, while fitting a replacement crossbeam, Lila said, "Can I ask about the fire?" Fern's hands stilled on the wood. She'd known this question would come eventually. "What do you want to know? What happened, if you're willing to tell me?" Fern set down her tools and sat on a stool. The workshop suddenly felt too warm, despite the November cold outside. It was October, dry season, high winds. Fire started in the grass behind Samuel's original workshop. Never found out what sparked it, could have been anything. The wind pushed it fast. She paused, gathering herself. Samuel was in the workshop. I was in the cabin making dinner. By the time I saw the flames, the whole backside was burning. I ran out screaming for him. He came to the door, saw how bad it was, went back inside. I thought he was getting out through the front, but he didn't come out. Lila waited, not pressing, just listening. Later they said he'd gone back for something, his journals maybe, or tools he couldn't replace. The roof collapsed. Neighbors arrived, pulled me back when I tried to go in after him. I fought them, screamed until my voice gave out. But he was already gone. I'm so sorry. Lila's voice was thick with emotion. I stayed in town that first month, at a motel. Couldn't face the property, but I couldn't leave either. Finally came back, rebuilt the workshop, had to do something with. She gestured vaguely at her chest. With all of this, the grief, the rage, the guilt, the absolute emptiness of waking up every morning knowing he wouldn't be there. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Lila said, I lost my marriage 5 years ago. Divorce, not death, but loss is loss. I kept thinking if I'd done things differently, been better somehow, maybe he wouldn't have left. Took me a long time to understand I couldn't have changed it. Some things just happen, and we survive them or we don't. You survived, so did you. Survival looks different than I expected, but it's still survival. The shared understanding created a bridge between them. Fern picked up her tools again, and they returned to work. But something had shifted. The workshop felt less like a fortress and more like a shared space. The rusted wagon hardware presented a particular challenge. The brackets, hinges, and other metal components had corroded badly over 40 years. Lila suggested replacing them with reproduction pieces, but Fern resisted. These are original, she explained, holding up a badly rusted bracket. Samuel would have forged or selected each one specifically. Replacing them would be like replacing parts of the wagon's soul. Can they be restored? Yes, it's labor-intensive, but yes. Fern set up a workstation for metal treatment, explaining the chemical process for rust removal. They'd soak pieces in vinegar. Solution, then scrub them with wire brushes, treat them with rust converter, and finally seal them with appropriate period oils. As they worked on the first batch of hardware, Lila said, Some things are worth saving, not replacing. Fern heard the deeper meaning in the words. Is that what we're doing? Saving things? Maybe. The wagon, each other, ourselves. Lila smiled slightly. Or maybe I'm reading too much into metalwork. No, Fern said quietly. I think you're exactly right. That evening, Lila stayed later than usual. They made dinner together in Fern's small kitchen, moving around each other with increasing ease. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, vegetables, bread, but sitting across the table from another person felt momentous after years of eating alone. Conversation flowed more easily now. Lila talked about her children, the pain of estrangement, her hopes for eventual reconciliation. Fern found herself sharing memories of Samuel, good ones, happy ones, stories she'd kept locked away because remembering hurt too much. He had this way of explaining things, Fern said. Patient, never condescending. If I didn't understand something the first time, he'd find a different way to teach it. Made me feel capable, even when I was learning from scratch. He was a good teacher, taught me basic woodworking when I was 12. I remember feeling so grown up using real tools. He would have loved this project. Restoring his early work, it would have meant everything to him. You're doing it for both of you, Lila observed. Fern considered this. Maybe I'm doing it for me, trying to find my way back to something. I don't know what yet. After dinner, they sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer weighted with awkwardness or pain. I've been thinking, Lila said eventually, about staying. Not at the motel. There's that old cabin about a mile down the road, belongs to the Petersons. They rent it cheap in winter. I could stay there, be closer to help with the project. Fern's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain distance, to keep her world small and controllable. But looking at Lila, seeing the hope and uncertainty in her expression, she realized she didn't want that anymore. The spare room upstairs is empty, Fern heard herself say. Has a bed, a dresser. If you wanted to stay here instead. You sure? No, but ask me anyway. Lila laughed, and the sound was warm in the cold night. Then yes, I'd like to stay. Okay. Fern felt something like relief, or maybe possibility, settling in her chest. Okay. That night, lying in her loft, with another person sleeping in the cabin below, Fern felt the shape of her life beginning to change. The solitude she'd wrapped around herself like armor was cracking, letting in light and air and human connection. It was terrifying and necessary, and maybe, possibly, exactly what she needed. In the darkness she thought of Samuel, wondering if he'd approve of this gradual emergence from isolation. She thought he would. He'd always believed in community, in the importance of connection, in not facing the world alone. I'm trying, she whispered to his memory. I'm really trying. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the forest, a coyote called. The mountain settled into night, and Fern settled into something that felt almost like peace. The work accelerated with 2 pairs of hands dedicated to it. Mornings began early, the workshop warming slowly as they fired up the wood stove and organized tools for the day's tasks. Lila moved her belongings into the spare room, and her presence transformed the cabin from a place of solitary survival into something closer to a home. 3 weeks into the restoration, they made a discovery that would change everything. Fern was removing the wagon bed to access the undercarriage when she noticed an irregularity in the construction. There was a gap between the floorboards and the frame, not damage, but deliberate design. A hidden compartment. Lila, look at this. They worked carefully, prying up boards that had been fitted to lift out rather than being permanently fixed. Beneath, in a space about 18 inches deep and running the length of the wagon bed, they found a carefully wrapped bundle. Fern lifted it out with reverent hands. The outer layer was oilcloth, stiff with age but intact. Beneath that, layers of canvas. And inside, fabric. The original wagon cover, removed and preserved rather than allowed to decay. The canvas was faded but structurally sound, showing the wear of its journey, west patches where tears had been mended, reinforced sections, careful stitching done by hand during long evenings on the trail. Look, Lila breathed, pointing to embroidery along one edge. Faded but still visible, initials worked in cross-stitch, E.K. and J.K. 1885. Emma and Joseph Kincaid. The couple Samuel had built the wagon for. Beneath the canvas, they found more treasures. Letters tied with ribbon, the paper yellowed and brittle. A tintype photograph in a leather case, a young couple, he serious and strong, she with a gentle smile and determined eyes. And wrapped in cloth, a child's toy, a wooden horse, hand-carved, worn smooth by small hands. Fern sat back on her heels, overcome. This wagon had carried a family west, had sheltered them through weather and hardship, had been important enough that when they finally reached their destination, they'd preserved these memories in a hidden space, maybe intending to retrieve them someday, or maybe just wanting to keep something of their journey safe. "We need to read these carefully," Lila said, touching the letters with gentle fingers. "They're fragile." They took the collection to the cabin, cleared the kitchen table, and spent the afternoon carefully examining each item. The letters told a story of hope and hardship, of a young couple leaving Pennsylvania for Montana Territory, seeking land and opportunity. Emma wrote to her mother, describing the journey in spare but vivid prose: the endless prairies, the mountain crossings, the small communities they passed through. The final letter was dated June 1885, written after they'd arrived and established their homestead. Emma described the land with love, a valley with a creek, pine forests, mountains visible in every direction. She wrote about building their cabin, planting their first crops, the overwhelming challenge and beauty of their new life. 20 miles northeast of the settlement at Bitterroot Ridge, Fern read aloud. "That's not far from here," Lila finished. The homestead was in this area. They looked at each other, understanding dawning. This wagon had traveled from Pennsylvania to Montana, had carried the Kincaids to land probably within 30 miles of where they now sat. The circle was tighter than either had imagined. "We should try to find out what happened to them," Fern said. "If they have descendants, they should know about this. The wagon, the letters, the photograph, it's their family history. The Historical Society might have records," Lila suggested, "homestead filings, census data. If the Kincaids established a successful claim, there'd be documentation." The next morning they drove to Bitterroot Ridge. The Historical Society occupied a small building next to the library, run by volunteers and open 3 days a week. Fern hadn't been inside in over a decade, maybe longer. The director was Pauline Driscoll, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who'd taught history at the high school before retiring. She recognized Fern immediately. "Fern Larrimore. Haven't seen you in years." "Been keeping to myself," Fern admitted. "I need help with research." Looking for information on a homesteading family, Emma and Joseph Kincaid arrived 1885. Pauline's expression sharpened with interest. "The Kincaids. Yes, I know that name. Come back to my office." She led them to a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and reference books. While she pulled documents, she talked. The Kincaids established a homestead in what's now part of the National Forest. Originally proved up 160 acres, that was the standard claim. Joseph filed in 1885, received the patent in 1890 after 5 years of improvements. She spread papers on her desk: homestead records, a hand-drawn map, census documents. They had children, 3 that I can find record of. The homestead eventually failed, most of them did. The land was sold around 1920. Family moved to town, seems like. "Are there descendants?" Lila asked. "Oh, yes. The Kincaid name is still around. Thomas Kincaid lives over in Whitehall County. He's done genealogy research, comes in here occasionally looking through records. He's the great-great-grandson, if I'm remembering right." Fern felt something tighten in her chest. Real people, real connection to this wagon and its history. "Could you contact him for me? I have something he should see." "The wagon?" Pauline's eyes lit up. "Word's gotten around that you bought an old prairie wagon. This was the Kincaid wagon? Built by my husband in 1884. We found items belonging to the family hidden inside it." Pauline leaned forward, fully engaged now. "That's remarkable. Significant historical find." "Yes, I'll contact Thomas. He'll want to know about this." They left the Historical Society with photocopies of records and Pauline's promise to facilitate contact. Driving back up the mountain, Fern felt something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement, purpose beyond mere survival. The restoration project was expanding beyond personal healing into something larger, something that connected past and present, that honored the lives of people who'd journeyed west with hopes and dreams. Back at the cabin, they spread the documents on the table alongside the letters and photograph. The Kincaid story was taking shape: young couple seeking new life, successful homestead for 3 decades, children raised in Montana wilderness, eventual sale and migration to town as the frontier closed. "We're not just restoring a wagon," Lila said softly. "We're recovering a family's history." "Samuel would love this," Fern said. "He always talked about craft being more than just building things. Said every piece carried the lives and stories of people who used it." I thought he was being poetic, but he was right. That evening, Fern took out the toy horse again, turning it in her hands. Some father had carved this for his child, maybe during the journey west, maybe afterward during a Montana winter. Small hands had played with it, had worn the wood smooth with use and love. It had survived 140 years, waiting to tell its story. She set it carefully on the mantel next to her wedding photograph. 2 families, 2 stories, connected across generations by a wagon and the craft that built it. Word spread through the community the way word does in small mountain towns, through conversations at the general store, through ranger station gossip, through the invisible network of people who pay attention to their neighbor's business. Fern was working on a wagon, Samuel's wagon. She'd found historical artifacts. The story grew with each telling. Hollis Grant stopped by one afternoon with a load of lumber he claimed was extra from another project. Fern knew charity when she saw it, but she also knew Hollis well enough to understand that refusing would offend. She accepted the wood and invited him to stay and see the work. He walked around the wagon slowly, examining joints and replacement pieces with a critical eye. "Solid work," he finally said. "Samuel would approve. That means something coming from you. He was the best craftsman I ever knew." "You're not far behind." Hollis touched the carved nameplate reverently, bringing his early work back to life. "That's honorable." After he left, Lila said, "He brought that lumber because he wanted to help." "I know. Are you going to let people help when we start the next phase?" Fern looked at her questioningly. "What next phase?" "Whatever you decide to do with the wagon once it's finished, you can't just keep it in your workshop forever." It was a fair point. Fern hadn't thought beyond restoration, hadn't considered what came after. The wagon was becoming something larger than a personal project, but she wasn't sure yet what that meant. The answer arrived 3 days later in the form of Thomas Kincaid. Pauline had contacted him, and he'd driven over from Whitehall County with his teenage daughter. Fern met them in the yard, suddenly nervous about this stranger's reaction to what she'd found. Thomas was in his early 50s, weathered and solid, with kind eyes that reminded her of the tintype photograph. His daughter Katie was maybe 16, curious and polite. "Miss Larrimore," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Pauline told me about the wagon. I can't quite believe it still exists." "It barely does. Been working to bring it back." Fern led them to the workshop, where the restoration was nearing completion. The frame was solid now, replacements blending seamlessly with original wood. The wheels were rebuilt and balanced, hardware gleamed with oil treatment. Thomas stopped, staring. His daughter moved closer, touching the wood gently. "My God," Thomas breathed. "This actually carried them west." "Across the continent," Fern confirmed. "Your ancestors trusted their lives to it. The craftsmanship is why it survived." She showed them the hidden compartment, then brought out the box containing the letters, photograph, canvas fragments, and toy horse. Thomas handled each item with reverence, reading the letters with tears in his eyes. Katie was transfixed by the photograph, comparing faces to family photos on her phone. "I knew the basic story," Thomas said, But these make them real. This is Emma's handwriting, Joseph's face, their actual journey, documented. There's more, Fern said, and shared what they'd learned from the Historical Society. The homestead location, the successful claim, the later sale. Thomas pulled out his phone and opened a map application. "The original homestead is here," he said, pointing. "About 20 miles northeast of here. The buildings are still standing, actually. Been abandoned for decades, but the main cabin and barn are intact. It's on national forest land now, protected from development." "You've seen it?" Lila asked. "Couple times. I do family history research, wanted to see where they lived. It's beautiful land, exactly how Emma described it in her letters." An idea was forming in Fern's mind, something audacious and probably impossible, but compelling. "What if—" she started, then stopped, unsure. "What if what?" Thomas prompted. "What if the wagon came home? What if we restored the homestead site, displayed the wagon there, created a historical site where people could learn about frontier life and traditional craftsmanship?" The words hung in the air. Lila was staring at her. Thomas looked stunned. "That would be—" Thomas started. "That would be incredible. But the property, the resources needed—" "I don't know how it would work," Fern admitted. "But this wagon deserves more than sitting in a workshop, and your family's story deserves to be told." Katie spoke up for the first time. "I'd love to learn about this. How they built things, how they traveled, what life was like. We learn about westward expansion in school, but it's just dates and facts. This is real." Thomas looked at his daughter, then back at Fern. "Let me think about this, talk to family, see what's possible. But Fern, thank you. For restoring this, for caring about people you never knew. It matters." After they left, taking careful photographs and detailed notes, Lila turned to Fern with an expression of amazement. "A historical site? Where did that come from?" "I don't know," Fern admitted, "but it felt right saying it. This wagon connected Samuel's craft to the Kincaid family's journey. Those stories shouldn't end. They should continue, should teach people about what came before." "That's a big undertaking." "Too big, probably, but maybe worth trying." That night, Fern couldn't sleep. She lay in her loft, thinking about possibilities, about expanding beyond the safe isolation she'd maintained for a decade. The idea of creating something public, something that would bring people to the mountain, should have terrified her. But instead, she felt energized, purposeful in a way she hadn't since before Samuel died. She climbed down and retrieved his journal, reading again about his pride in the wagon, his dreams of building a life in Montana. He'd wanted to pass on knowledge, to keep traditional craftsmanship alive. A teaching site would honor that legacy. In the morning, she found Lila at the kitchen table with coffee and a notebook full of ideas. They'd both been thinking through the night. "The homestead buildings would need restoration," Lila said, "but they're structurally sound, according to Thomas. We could create demonstration areas, woodworking, blacksmithing, traditional crafts, the wagon as centerpiece, the Kincaid artifacts on display, educational programs for schools. We'd need funding, volunteers, official permissions. Pauline would help with the Historical Society's support. Thomas represents the family. And you're Samuel's widow, a master craftswoman yourself. People respect that." Fern felt momentum building, felt herself being carried towards something larger than she'd imagined possible. It was frightening and exhilarating. "Let's finish the wagon first," she said. "Then we'll see what's possible." But she knew, even as she said it, that the decision was already made. Samuel's dream of a teaching center, of passing on traditional knowledge, would become her dream too. She'd honor his legacy by building what he'd envisioned, by creating something that would outlast them both. The toy horse sat on the mantel, worn smooth by generations. Beside it, her wedding photograph showed two people who'd built a life together. Now she'd build something new, not to replace what was lost, but to honor it and carry it forward. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. A new day, a new purpose, a new beginning emerging from 10 years of grief-bound isolation. Fern stood at the window and watched light spread across the landscape. Samuel would have loved this view, this moment, this possibility of craft and tradition finding new life. "I'm going to do it," she said aloud, to the memory of him, to herself, to the future she was beginning to believe in again. "I'm going to build something that matters." The wagon was nearly complete. 6 weeks of intensive work had transformed the rotted relic into something beautiful, historically accurate, structurally sound, a testament to both Samuel's original craftsmanship and Fern's painstaking restoration. The oak glowed with proper treatment, the hardware functioned smoothly, and the replicated canvas cover looked appropriately aged while being functionally new. Thomas returned on a cold December morning to see the final product. His daughter Katie was with him again, and this time they brought others, Thomas's wife Maria, his brother James, and his elderly aunt Violet, who'd grown up hearing stories about Emma and Joseph directly from her grandmother. They stood in the workshop in reverent silence. Violet approached the wagon slowly, leaning on her cane, and placed a trembling hand on the seat. "Grandmother Emma sat here," she said softly, "held her babies here." This was real to her. The moment was profound. Fern felt the weight of generations, the connection of past and present through an object that had witnessed and survived. Thomas cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about your idea, the historical site. Talked to family, contacted the Forest Service about the homestead property. There might be possibilities. We'd like to help," Maria added. "This is our family's story, but it's also Montana's story. It should be preserved." They discussed logistics, property access, restoration requirements, funding sources. Pauline had already begun researching grant programs for historical preservation. The Forest Service was interested in educational programming on public lands. As they talked, Fern felt something building, a collective energy, a shared purpose. What had started as a solitary project to fill her days was becoming something larger, something meaningful beyond her personal healing. Thomas mentioned that he'd brought something to show Fern. "I've been doing more research since we last met. Found something interesting." He pulled out a folder of documents. The homestead didn't just fail randomly. Joseph sold it in 1,920 to a land company. The sale document lists what was included with the property. He handed Fern a photocopied deed. She scanned it, her eyes catching on the itemized list. Cabin, barn, well, fencing, tools, and her heart stopped. One prairie wagon, substantial condition, with cover and equipment. The wagon was sold with the property, Thomas explained. Stayed there for decades. Eventually the land company failed, property reverted to federal ownership, became part of the national forest. The wagon just stayed. Until the Forest Service cleared the abandoned homestead last year and sent everything to auction. Fern's mind reeled. The wagon had made the journey west, had served the Kincaid family for 35 years, had been sold with the homestead, and had remained there for a century before finally leaving. It had come full circle, built near Pennsylvania, traveled to Montana, stayed in one place for 100 years, then found its way back to the hands of the man who built it, or to his widow, decades after his death. "There's more," Thomas said carefully. "When I was examining the homestead property last week, I found something in the old cabin, hidden behind a loose board." He pulled out another document, this one in a protective plastic sleeve. "It's a land deed. Recent, dated about 10 years ago." Fern took it with shaking hands. The deed was for the Kincaid homestead property, 160 acres of national forest land being sold to a private buyer through some kind of federal land exchange program. The buyer's name made her vision blur. Samuel Larrimore. "I don't understand," she whispered. "He bought the land," Thomas said gently. 6 months before he died, according to the date. There's a letter, too. It was with the deed. The envelope was addressed to Fern in Samuel's familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it. My dearest Fern, if you're reading this, I've finally worked up the courage to show you what I've been planning. Our 20th anniversary is next month, and I wanted to give you something extraordinary. I tracked down the Kincaid property, the homestead built by the family who traveled in my first important wagon. When I learned it was available through a federal land exchange program, I couldn't resist. I bought it for us. My dream is to restore the original buildings and create a teaching center, a place where traditional craftsmanship isn't just remembered, but actively practiced and taught. You and I together, passing on skills that are disappearing from the world. The wagon will be the centerpiece. I've tried to track it down for years, but it seems to have vanished. I've drawn up plans there with this deed. I want us to build this together, to create something that will outlast us, a legacy of craft and knowledge. I know this is ambitious, but ambitious dreams are worth pursuing, especially with the person you love beside you. Happy anniversary, my love. Let's build something beautiful, together. Yours always. Samuel. Fern couldn't breathe. The workshop walls seemed to close in. Samuel had bought the land, had dreamed this exact dream, the teaching center, the historical preservation, passing on traditional skills, had planned it as their shared future. And 2 weeks before their anniversary, before he could tell her, the fire had taken him. She was holding the deed to land Samuel had purchased for them both, land he'd wanted them to restore together. The dream she'd articulated to Thomas days ago was actually Samuel's dream, hidden for 10 years, waiting to be discovered. Lila was beside her suddenly, supporting her as her knees went weak. Breathe, Fern, just breathe. He knew, Fern gasped. He found the property. He planned all of this. Thomas looked stricken. I'm so sorry. I thought you knew. I thought maybe I never knew. Fern clutched the letter, Samuel's handwriting blurring through her tears. He was going to surprise me. And then, the fire, the anniversary that never happened, 10 years of grief and isolation when Samuel had been planning this beautiful shared future. She looked at the deed again, seeing details she'd missed. The plans he'd mentioned, Thomas pulled them out, architectural sketches showing the homestead restoration in precise detail. Samuel had designed workshop spaces, teaching areas, display areas, had envisioned exactly what she'd proposed to Thomas, down to specific details. He hid these in the wagon, Thomas said softly. The deed, the letter, the plans. He put them in the false bottom, planning to reveal everything when he showed you the restored wagon. But the fire happened first. The wagon went to auction before he could finish it or tell you. Everything clicked into place. The wagon finding her, the hidden compartment, the artifacts connecting past and present. This wasn't coincidence or fate, it was Samuel's unfinished gift, waiting a decade to be discovered. Fern sat down hard on a workshop stool, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this meant. Samuel's dream hadn't died with him. It had been waiting, dormant, for her to be ready to receive it. The wagon restoration wasn't just about healing her grief, it was about completing what Samuel had started, honoring his vision by bringing it to life. The land, she said, her voice rough. The deed is in Samuel's name. Is it? It's yours, Thomas said. You're his legal heir. The property is yours if you want it. The Forest Service confirmed it when I inquired. Hers. 160 acres of Montana land with original homestead buildings, the exact property Samuel had chosen, the foundation for the dream he'd wanted them to build together. Lila knelt beside her. You don't have to decide anything right now. But Fern was already deciding, already seeing the path forward with sudden clarity. She couldn't build this dream with Samuel that future had burned 10 years ago, but she could build it anyway, could honor his vision by making it real, could create the teaching center he'd imagined, even if he wouldn't be there to see it. "I want to see it," she said. "The land, the buildings. I need to see what he chose for us." Thomas nodded. "I'll take you there today if you want." They drove in convoy, Thomas's truck leading, Fern and Lila following in Lila's vehicle. The journey took 40 minutes, winding through national forest on increasingly rough roads. Finally, they turned onto an overgrown track and climbed through pine forest to a high meadow. And there it was, the Kincaid homestead. The main cabin stood solid despite decades of abandonment, chinked logs still tight, roof sagging but intact. The barn was larger than Fern expected, built to last with hand-hewn beams visible through gaps in the siding. A smaller building workshop or storage completed the cluster. Beyond the buildings, a creek ran through the meadow, and mountains rose on all sides, spectacular and eternal. Fern climbed out of the truck slowly. The land was beautiful, exactly as Emma Kincaid had described it in her letters. Pine forest surrounding open meadow, water and shelter, mountains defining the horizon. Samuel had chosen well. She walked to the cabin, pushed open the door. Inside was emptiness and potential single room with loft, fireplace, windows overlooking the meadow. Dust and debris covered the floor, but the structure was sound. The workshop building was smaller but purposeful. She could imagine Samuel's sketches coming to life here: workbenches, tool storage, teaching spaces. Room for multiple students to learn traditional crafts in an authentic setting. She stepped back outside. Thomas, Maria, and Lila were waiting respectfully, giving her space to process. Katie was walking the property, taking photographs. Fern looked at the buildings, the land, the mountains. Felt Samuel's presence not as absence but as blueprint. He'd chosen this place for them, had seen what it could become, had trusted her to help build it. Now she'd have to build it without him. But she wouldn't be alone. The community was already forming: Lila, Thomas and his family, Pauline, Hollis. People who believed in the dream, even if they'd never met the dreamer. "I'm going to do it," she said, loud enough for them all to hear. "I'm going to restore this place and create the teaching center. Samuel's vision will become real." Thomas smiled, relieved and moved. "We'll help however we can." The sun was lowering toward the mountains, painting everything in golden light. Fern stood in the meadow Samuel had chosen and made a promise to his memory, to herself, to the future she was choosing to build. The wagon had brought her here. Samuel's dream had survived to find her. Now she'd do the work, the hard, beautiful work of bringing vision into reality. The week following the discovery passed in a blur of emotion and planning. Fern oscillated between grief for what Samuel had intended and determination to honor his vision. She read his letter repeatedly, studied his architectural sketches, tried to understand the scope of what he'd imagined. Lila stayed close, providing quiet support without pressing. They continued work on the wagon, completing final details, but the focus had shifted. The wagon was no longer the project, it was the seed of something larger. 3 days after seeing the homestead, Fern sat at her kitchen table with Samuel's sketches spread before her. His handwriting filled the margins with notes and specifications. He'd researched historical accuracy, studied traditional building methods, designed teaching programs. The depth of his planning was staggering. "He was so thorough," she said to Lila. "He'd thought through everything: structural restoration, educational programming, funding strategies. This wasn't a dream. It was a blueprint." "He knew you'd be his partner in it," Lila observed. "He designed this for both of you to build together." The words hit Fern hard. Samuel had seen this as their shared legacy, their contribution to preserving dying crafts and knowledge. He'd trusted her skills, her dedication, her vision. The fire had stolen their partnership, but it hadn't stolen the vision itself. "I can't do this alone," Fern admitted. "I don't have the resources, the expertise, You're not alone," Lila interrupted firmly. "You have me. You have Thomas and his family. You have Pauline and the Historical Society. You have Hollis and everyone else who's already invested in this story. Fern looked at her sister-in-law, seeing the determination in her expression. Why are you doing this? You could go back to your life. Leave all this mountain drama behind. Lila's smile was sad but genuine. Because I need this as much as you do. My marriage failed. My kids won't talk to me. I've been drifting for 5 years trying to find something that matters. This matters. Samuel matters. You matter. Helping build something meaningful that's reason enough. The honesty between them had grown over weeks of working together, but this felt deeper. 2 women, reshaped by loss, finding purpose in preserving the past and building the future. Okay, Fern said, then let's figure out how to actually do this. They started with Pauline. The Historical Society director arrived the next afternoon, immediately falling in love with Samuel's plans. She brought contacts, resources, knowledge of preservation grants, and educational program funding. Within an hour, she'd identified 3 potential funding sources and outlined a timeline for applications. The wagon gives you credibility, Pauline explained. Physical proof of traditional craftsmanship. The Kincaid family connection adds historical significance. Samuel's documented plans show this isn't just sentiment, it's serious historical preservation and education. Thomas visited again, this time with his brother James, who worked in construction. They walked the homestead property with Fern, assessing the building's structural integrity. James's verdict was encouraging all 3 structures were salvageable with proper restoration. Your husband knew what he was looking at, James said, studying the main cabin. These logs are sound, foundations solid, roof needs complete replacement. But that's doable. I'd estimate 6 months of focused work to bring the cabin back to historically accurate condition. What about cost? Fern asked, though she dreaded the answer. Materials maybe $15,000 if we're careful. Labor depends on volunteers versus contractors. But it's achievable, especially with the right support. Word continued spreading through the community. Hollis committed to donating materials at cost. A retired teacher from the high school expressed interest in developing curriculum. The Forest Service ranger who managed the land lease offered organizational support. People wanted to help. The story of Samuel's hidden dream resonated, touched something in people about legacy and preservation. Fern found herself at the center of growing enthusiasm, both grateful and overwhelmed. Late one evening, she and Lila sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against December cold. The mountains were sharp silhouettes against star-filled sky. I'm afraid, Fern admitted. Afraid of failing him. Afraid of not being good enough to build what he envisioned. You're not afraid of failing Samuel, Lila said quietly. You're afraid of living without him, of building a future that doesn't include the past you lost. The words struck deep. Fern sat with them, feeling their truth. For 10 years, she'd existed in a kind of suspended animation, not fully alive because living meant acknowledging loss. Building Samuel's dream meant stepping forward into a life that would be different from anything they'd planned together. He's gone, Fern said, voice breaking. He'll never see this, never know if I succeed or fail. But his dream isn't gone. His vision, his hope for what could be built that survived. And you're the one who can make it real. Lila reached over and squeezed Fern's hand. Samuel trusted you to be his partner. Now you honor that trust by being your own architect. You don't have to build what he would have built. You build what you can build, informed by his vision but shaped by your own. Something shifted in Fern's chest. Permission she hadn't known she needed to adapt Samuel's dream, to make it her own while honoring his intent. To build forward rather than trying to recreate a lost past. I'm going to need a lot of help, she said. Yes, and people are ready to give it. They organized a community meeting for the following week. Fern was terrified of public speaking, of putting herself forward as the leader of something this significant. But Lila and Pauline convinced her that people needed to hear the vision directly from her to understand why this mattered. 23 people showed up at the library's community room. Fern recognized some neighbors, business owners, historical society members. Others were strangers drawn by word of mouth and curiosity. She stood at the front of the room with Samuel's sketches displayed on a projector, her hands shaking, her voice uncertain at first, but growing stronger as she spoke. She told them about Samuel's craftsmanship, about the wagon built in 1884 that carried the Kincaids west, about buying that wagon for $10 without knowing its history, about discovering Samuel's maker's mark, then his hidden plans and the land he'd purchased, about his dream of a teaching center preserving traditional skills. "He wanted to build this with me," she said, her voice steady now. "That's not possible anymore. But the dream is still possible. The need for it is still real. Craftsmanship traditions are disappearing. People are disconnected from how things are made, from the skills that built this country. Samuel believed that knowledge was worth preserving, worth teaching." She gestured to the sketches. "This is his blueprint. The Larrimore Kincaid Heritage Workshop, named for both families whose stories connect through that wagon. A place where people can learn traditional woodworking, metalwork, historical crafts. Where school groups can understand frontier life through actual experience. Where the past informs the present." The room was silent, attentive. Fern felt the weight of their attention, their assessment, their potential judgment. "I can't do this alone," she admitted. "I need help, financial, practical, organizational. I need people who believe this matters, who want to see something like this exist. If you're interested in being part of this, in helping build something that will outlast all of us, I'm asking for your help." The silence held for a moment. Then Hollis stood. "I'll donate materials," he said gruffly, "and labor when I can manage it." Pauline stood next. "The Historical Society will sponsor grant applications and provide organizational support." Thomas and his family stood together. "We're in. However we can help." One by one, others rose, commitments of time, skills, resources. A retired carpenter offered to lead restoration work. A grant writer volunteered her services. A local business owner pledged financial support. Fern felt tears threatening as the community coalesced around Samuel's vision. These people, most of whom she barely knew, were choosing to believe in something they'd never seen, based on plans from a man they'd never met. After the meeting, people clustered around the sketches, asking questions, offering ideas, building enthusiasm. Lila stood beside Fern, radiating satisfaction. "You did it," she murmured. "You gave them a reason to care." "Samuel did it," Fern corrected. "I'm just the messenger." "No, you're the builder. Samuel gave the vision. You're making it real." That night, Fern couldn't sleep. She went to the workshop, where the completed wagon stood waiting. In the dim light, it looked ready to roll west again, ready to carry another family's dreams across uncertain terrain. She pulled out a new journal, leather-bound like Samuel's, but blank, waiting for her words. On the first page she wrote the date, then, "Samuel, I found your dream. I found the land, the plans, the vision you wanted us to build together. I can't build it with you, but I can build it for you. For us, for everyone who believes craft and tradition matter. This journal will document the work, the way yours documented the wagon. I promise to honor your vision while making it my own. I promise to build something worthy of your legacy. And I promise to finally move forward, to live fully in the present while honoring the past. Watch over this. Wherever you are, help me build something beautiful." She closed the journal and sat in the quiet workshop. Outside, winter was settling over the mountains. Inside, a new beginning was taking shape, fragile still, but growing stronger. Tomorrow, she'd begin the practical work of turning vision into reality. Tonight, she simply sat with the decision, with the commitment she'd made publicly and privately, with the understanding that grief and growth could coexist, that honoring the dead meant living fully for their dreams. The wagon waited, ready for its final journey home to the land where the Kincaids had built their life, where Samuel had envisioned building his legacy. Fern would take it there, along with all the hope and determination of a community ready to build something that mattered. Spring arrived with a rush of snowmelt and returning birds. 6 months after discovering Samuel's plans, the project was becoming reality. Fern had spent winter finalizing permits, securing grants, organizing volunteers. The work was daunting but purposeful. Every phone call, every application, every planning meeting brought the vision closer. The wagon was complete. Fern had added the final touches in late February, period-accurate paint in traditional colors, Samuel's original maker's mark restored and visible, her own mark added beside it in complementary script. The canvas cover was fitted and secured. Every wheel turned smoothly, every joint was solid. It stood in her workshop like a piece of captured history, ready for its homecoming. She'd commissioned a brass dedication plaque, carefully worded after much consideration. Built 1884 by Samuel Larrimore, master craftsman. Traveled 1885 by Emma and Joseph Kincaid. Pioneer Family Restored 2024 by Fern Larrimore. May this wagon inspire future generations to honor craft, preserve tradition, and remember the journeys that built Montana. The plaque would mount on the wagon's side, visible but not ostentatious. A marker connecting past and present, honoring everyone who'd touched this piece of living history. The community gathering was planned for a Saturday in early April. Word had spread beyond Bitterroot Ridge. The regional newspaper ran a feature story, and Montana Historical Society expressed interest in partnership. What Fern had envisioned as a small local event was growing into something larger. The morning arrived clear and warm, snow lingering only in shaded areas. Fern had barely slept, nerves and anticipation keeping her awake. Lila found her on the porch at dawn. Ready for this? No. But we're doing it anyway. They'd invited people to come to the cabin first, to see the completed wagon before transporting it to the homestead. By 10 o'clock, the yard was full of trucks and people, neighbors, historical society members, Thomas's extended family, volunteers who'd committed to the restoration project. Fern led them into the workshop. The doors opened wide, morning light flooding in to illuminate the wagon. The collective intake of breath was gratifying. "My God," someone whispered. "It's beautiful." And it was. The oak glowed with proper treatment. Traditional paint colors created authentic appearance. The canvas cover looked ready for continental travel. This was no museum piece. It was a functional, historically accurate prairie wagon that could roll west tomorrow if needed. Katie Kincaid stood transfixed, tears running down her face. Great-great-grandma Emma sat right there," she said softly, pointing to the seat. "This is real." She was real. Fern had prepared brief remarks, though public speaking still terrified her. She stood beside the wagon and faced the gathered crowd. "Thank you all for coming. 6 months ago, I bought this wagon for $10, not knowing its history or significance. Finding Samuel's maker's mark started a journey that's brought us here to honor traditional craftsmanship, to preserve family history, and to build something that connects generations." She gestured to the wagon. This carried the Kincaid family to Montana Territory in 1885. It represented their hopes, their courage, their determination to build new lives. Samuel Larrimore built it with skill and care that let it survive 140 years. I've restored it not just as an object, but as a symbol of what's possible when craft and purpose align. The crowd listened attentively. Fern felt her nervousness fading as she spoke about what mattered. "Today we're taking the wagon home to the Kincaid homestead, where it spent a century, to the land Samuel chose for our teaching center. Starting this summer, we'll begin restoring the original buildings. By next spring, we'll open the Larrimore Kincaid Heritage Workshop to students, visitors, anyone who wants to learn traditional skills and connect with Montana's past. She paused, emotion threatening to overcome her. Samuel didn't live to see this, but his vision survived. And with your help, we're making it real. Thank you for believing in something you couldn't see yet. Thank you for investing in preservation and education. Thank you for helping build something that will outlast all of us. Spontaneous applause broke out. People crowded around the wagon asking questions, offering congratulations, taking photographs. Thomas presented Fern with the Kincaid family artifacts in a custom-made display case, tears in his eyes. "These belong with the wagon now," he said. "They're going home together." Hollis approached with characteristic gruffness. "Samuel would be proud. You did right by his work." "We all did," Fern corrected. "This is community achievement." They loaded the wagon carefully onto a flatbed trailer for transport to the homestead. The drive would take an hour, and a caravan of vehicles followed 20 cars carrying people who wanted to witness the wagon's return. Fern rode in the truck with Lila, following the trailer. She watched the wagon through the rear window, imagining Emma and Joseph's original journey, imagining Samuel's young hands building each component with care. "Nervous about the next phase?" Lila asked. "Terrified, but good terrified. Purposeful terrified. That's the best kind." As they climbed into the mountains toward the homestead, Fern felt something settle in her chest. This was right. Hard, uncertain, ambitious, but fundamentally right. She was building Samuel's dream while creating her own future, honoring the past while stepping forward into possibility. The wagon was going home, and so was she. The homestead meadow was transformed. Volunteers had cleared brush, marked building foundations, set up temporary facilities. The setting was spectacular mountains rising on all sides, pine forests surrounding open grassland, the creek running clear with snowmelt. They positioned the wagon prominently near the main cabin, angled so visitors would see it immediately upon arrival. Fern supervised the placement with exacting precision, wanting it perfect. When the wagon finally settled into position, when the trailer was removed and it stood on its own wheels on land where it had spent a century, something profound happened. The crowd fell silent, recognizing the moment's significance. This wagon had traveled from Pennsylvania to Montana territory, carrying a young family's hopes, had served them for decades, had been sold with the land, had remained here through generations of abandonment. And now it was home, restored and honored, ready to teach new generations about the past. Thomas stepped forward with his family. Violet, the elderly aunt who'd touched the wagon that first day in Fern's workshop, was helped forward by younger relatives. She placed both hands on the wagon seat and closed her eyes. "Welcome home," she whispered. "Emma and Joseph would be so happy." The afternoon became celebration. People brought food, shared stories, explored the homestead buildings. Pauline gave an impromptu historical presentation. James outlined restoration plans for the structures. Volunteers committed to summer work schedules. Fern found herself surrounded by enthusiasm and commitment. The project that had seemed impossibly ambitious 6 months ago was manifesting through collective effort. She wasn't building alone, she was facilitating community investment in shared heritage. Late afternoon, as the crowd began thinning, Katie Kincaid approached Fern hesitantly. "Miss Larrimore, would you teach me? Traditional woodworking, I mean?" Like Samuel knew. Fern looked at the teenager's eager expression and felt something warm spread through her chest. This was exactly what Samuel had envisioned, passing knowledge to new generations, keeping skills alive through teaching. "Yes," she said simply. "When the workshop is operational, you'll be my first student." Katie's smile was brilliant. "Thank you. I want to learn how they built things, how to make something that lasts." After she left, Lila appeared at Fern's elbow. "You just acquired an apprentice." "Looks like it. Samuel would love that. You know he would." Fern nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She could almost hear Samuel's voice, feel his approval. He'd always believed craft was meant to be shared. that knowledge only mattered if it continued beyond individual practitioners. Evening descended softly over the mountains. Most people had left, but a core group remained: Lila, Thomas and Maria, Pauline, Hollis, James, a handful of committed volunteers. They built a fire in the meadow and sat around it as darkness gathered. "To Samuel," Hollis said, raising a coffee cup, "to his craft and his vision. To Emma and Joseph," Thomas added, "to their courage and their journey. To Fern," Lila said firmly, "to her dedication and strength in making this real." Fern felt tears threatening but pushed them back. "To all of us. This only works because we're building it together." They sat in comfortable silence, fire crackling, stars emerging overhead. The wagon stood nearby, solid and beautiful in the firelight, exactly where it belonged. "What's the timeline?" James asked eventually. "When do we start actual restoration?" "June," Fern said. "We'll begin with the main cabin, new roof, floor repair, chinking, structural stabilization. Historical accuracy is priority. Modern utilities only where absolutely necessary for safety and function." "I can organize weekend work crews," James offered. "Lots of people want hands-on involvement." "I'll coordinate with schools for fall educational programming," Pauline added. "Field trips, demonstrations, curriculum integration." The planning continued, practical and detailed. Fern contributed where needed, but mostly listened, amazed at the competence and commitment surrounding her. These people believed in the vision. They were investing time and resources because it mattered to them. Later, after everyone else had left, Fern and Lila walked the property together. They stood at the edge of the meadow, looking back at the wagon and buildings silhouetted against starlight. "Thank you," Fern said quietly, "for everything. For pushing me out of isolation, for believing this was possible, for being family when I needed it most." "Thank you for letting me in," Lila countered, "for giving me purpose again. This project saved me as much as it saved you." They stood shoulder to shoulder, two women who'd found each other through loss and craft, through determination and shared vision. Fern pulled out her journal and made the day's entry by flashlight. "The wagon came home today. Samuel's dream is becoming real. I'm not alone anymore. I have family, community, purpose beyond survival. Tomorrow we begin building the teaching center. Tomorrow and all the days after. For Samuel, for the Kincaids, for everyone who believes tradition and craft matter. But mostly for myself, because I finally understand that living fully honors the dead better than any amount of grief-bound isolation." She closed the journal and looked at the stars Samuel used to name for her. She still couldn't remember all the constellations, but she was learning to live with what she'd forgotten while building something new with what she remembered. Spring became summer. The mountains shed their snow, wildflowers colored the meadows, and the Larrimore Kincaid Heritage Workshop began taking physical form. Work crews arrived most weekends, volunteers with construction skills, historical preservation knowledge, or simply willing hands. James organized the effort with military precision, and the buildings transformed week by week. The main cabin's new roof went up first, historically accurate cedar shakes, hands split by volunteers under Hollis's supervision. Floor repairs followed, then window restoration, chinking, careful preservation of original logs. Fern divided her time between the homestead and her mountain cabin, spending weekdays preparing materials and planning, weekends working alongside volunteers. The physical labor was demanding, but she welcomed it. Building something tangible, seeing progress in real time, it was deeply satisfying. Lila had become indispensable. She coordinated volunteers, managed logistics, handled communications with funding organizations and educational institutions. Her organizational skills transformed chaos into structured progress. By late July, the main cabin was weathertight and structurally sound. The interior restoration began: historically accurate furnishings, period-appropriate tools and household items, educational displays explaining frontier life. Thomas's family contributed Kincaid artifacts, creating a living museum of their ancestors' experience. The barn became the primary workshop space. They installed workbenches, tool storage, demonstration areas. The design emphasized functionality while maintaining historical character. Students would learn traditional craftsmanship in an authentic setting, using period-appropriate tools and techniques. Katie Kincaid arrived 3 days a week through summer, eager and dedicated. Fern taught her wood selection, tool maintenance, basic joinery. Watching the teenager's skills develop, seeing her pride in completed projects, reminded Fern powerfully of learning from Samuel decades ago. The cycle of knowledge continuing through generations, exactly what Samuel had envisioned. "You're a good teacher," Lila observed one afternoon, watching Fern guide Katie through dovetail joint construction. "Samuel was a good teacher. I'm just passing on what he taught me. That's exactly what teaching is, and you're gifted at it." Other students followed Katie's example, a retired veteran seeking purpose, a middle-aged woman wanting to learn her grandfather's craft, 2 high school boys interested in traditional skills. Fern found herself teaching regularly, adapting Samuel's patient methodology to each student's needs and learning style. The work was fulfilling in ways she hadn't anticipated. Teaching forced her to articulate knowledge she'd internalized, to break down complex skills into learnable steps, to connect with people around shared interest in craft. She was good at it. More than good, she was passionate about it. Autumn arrived with golden aspens and crisp mornings. The buildings were substantially complete, ready for the official opening planned for October, 1 year after Fern had bought the wagon for $10. The week before opening, Fern stood in the barn workshop alone, running her hand along a workbench she'd built, following Samuel's original design. The space was ready, tools organized, materials stored, teaching areas prepared. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This was it. Samuel's dream made real through collective effort and determination. She heard footsteps and turned to find Thomas and Violet approaching. The elderly woman moved, slowly but determinedly, eyes bright with interest. "Wanted to see it before the crowds arrive," Thomas explained. Fern walked them through the space, explaining the layout, the teaching programs, the preservation philosophy. Violet touched tools and workbenches with reverent hands, murmuring appreciation. "Emma and Joseph would be so proud," she said finally. "This honors them beautifully. Honors everyone who built and traveled and dreamed in this place." "That's the goal," Fern said, "to honor the past while teaching the future." Opening day was perfect. Clear October sky, autumn colors blazing, warm enough for comfortable outdoor activities. Over 200 people attended, far exceeding expectations. Local television news covered the event. Montana Historical Society sent representatives. The governor sent a letter of commendation. The wagon stood as centerpiece, polished and beautiful, surrounded by informational displays explaining its history and restoration. Children climbed carefully aboard, while parents photographed them. Historians examined joinery and construction methods. Everyone recognized they were witnessing something special, history preserved and activated, tradition honored through education. Fern gave a brief dedication speech, standing before the crowd with Lila, Thomas, Pauline, Hollis, and Katie beside her. "1 year ago, I bought a broken wagon for $10, not knowing it would change everything. Today, we open the Larrimore Kincaid Heritage Workshop, named for my husband, Samuel Larrimore, who built this wagon in 1884, and for Emma and Joseph Kincaid, who traveled in it to build their Montana life." She gestured to the restored buildings. "This isn't just history preservation. It's living tradition. Here, students will learn skills that built this country: woodworking, metalwork, traditional crafts. They'll connect with the past through actual practice, understanding frontier life by experiencing the work it required." Her voice strengthened with emotion. "Samuel dreamed this. He chose this land, designed these programs, envisioned this exact center. He didn't live to build it himself. But his vision survived, and with incredible community support, we've made it real. This is his legacy. The Kincaid's legacy. Montana's legacy. And now, it's our responsibility to maintain and expand it for future generations. The crowd's applause was warm and sustained. People queued for tours, for demonstrations, for information about classes and programs. Late afternoon, as crowds thinned and volunteers began cleanup, Fern walked alone to the meadow edge. The wagon stood in afternoon light, exactly as Samuel had envisioned. The buildings were alive with purpose. Students would come, would learn, would carry forward traditions that might otherwise die. She pulled out her journal, now half filled with entries documenting the year's journey. "Samuel, we did it. The Larrimore Kincaid Heritage Workshop is open. Your dream is real, alive, teaching. I can't share this with you the way you planned, but I feel you here anyway. In every joint, every tool, every student's first successful project, you're here in what we built." She closed the journal and stood watching mountains turn gold in setting sun. 10 years of grief hadn't disappeared, loss didn't work that way. But purpose had transformed it, had given her reason to move forward while honoring what came before. Some losses change you completely. But sometimes, from the deepest loss, you build something that changes everything. She turned back toward the workshop where Lila was waiting. Tomorrow they'd begin the first official classes. Tomorrow and all the days after, teaching traditional skills to new generations, building Samuel's legacy while creating her own. The wagon stood ready, waiting to tell its story to everyone who would listen, and Fern stood ready to teach everyone who wanted to learn.